For Chapter 17, The West Exploiting an Empire. After the Civil War, Americans who believed expansion was their manifest destiny began moving westward across the continent, subduing the Native Americans through various means, creating a North American empire. Beyond the frontier. Prior to the Civil War, the march of white settlement paused at the margin of the semi-arid Great Plains, a region seared by hot winds in the summer and buffeted by blizzards of hailstorms in the winter, presenting a temporary obstacle to further migration. Crushing the Native Americans. Because they were seen as an additional obstacle to further white migration, the Native Americans were pushed from their lands and forced to radically change their culture by the end of the century. Those who did not peaceably acquiesce were beaten into submission. Life of the Plains Indians. After they acquired the Spanish horse, the Plain Indians abandoned their former agricultural lifestyle in favor of a strong, unique culture based upon nomadic hunting of the buffalo. Though the Plains Indians generally existed in tribes of thousands of people, they lived in smaller bands of several hundreds. Within Plains culture, men and women existed in relative egalitarianism, as the occupations of both were necessary to group survival. As long as the waters run, searching for an Indian policy. Early in the century, the Great Plains, known as the Great American Desert, was considered by the United States government as unusable for whites and was given to the Native Americans as one big reservation. But with the discovery of gold in the West, the federal government began a policy of concentration, considering restricting tribes to specific limited reservations. This new policy led to conflicts and violence among Native American groups and whites. Final battle on the plains. From 1867 to 1890, the federal government fought a number of tribes in brutal military campaigns, eliminating any semblance of resistance and culminating in a massacre at Wounded Knee. The end of tribal life. In the 1870s and 1880s, Congress began a new policy to try to end tribal authority, turn Native Americans into farmers, and educate their children to be more like whites. The Dawes Act of 1887 forced Native Americans to live on individual plots of land and allowed 90 million acres in Indian land to be sold to white settlers. But the crushing blow to traditional tribal ways resulted from a near extermination of the buffalo by white hunters. By 1900, there were only 250,000 Native Americans counted in the census, down from nearly 5 million in 1492. Most of them suffered from extreme poverty and the problems associated with it. Settlement of the West. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, whites, along with some blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, moved west seeking adventure or religious freedom, as in the case of the Mormons, and better health and economic opportunity. Men and women on the Overland Trail. Some 1/2 million settlers flocked to the west, especially California and Oregon. In the 3 decades after the gold rush of 1849, traveling the Overland Trail, men and women found the journey both arduous and dangerous. For women in particular, the movement to the west meant separation from friends and family, loneliness, and exhaustive work. Land for the taking. Government policy, beginning with the Homestead Act of 1862, provided free or inexpensive land to individual settlers. Land speculators and private corporations like railroads, all of whom were eager to supply the desires of a growing nation for the product of the West. Railroads became the West's largest landowners. Often, unscrupulous speculators and companies took advantage of these government land programs. Territorial governments. Territorial governments. The new territories of the West related to the federal government much like colonies. The generations that grew up in the territorial West often developed distinctive ideas about politics, government, and the economy. The Spanish-speaking Southwest. The Spanish-Mexican heritage of the Southwest also influenced Americans in the West and gave a distinctive shape to the area's politics, language, society, and law. The Bonanza West. Quest for quick profits left the boom and bust cycles in the Western economy, wasted resources, and uneven growth. The Mining Bonanza. Lured by the prospect of mineral wealth throughout the region, many settlers moved west, building hastily and often short-lived communities that reflected primarily materialistic and exploitive interests. Individual prospectors made the first strike using a process of place mining. As the placers gave out, corporations moved in to dig the deep shafts, employing many foreign-born miners who faced hostility and discrimination. Huge strikes like the Comstock Lode added millions of dollars to the economy, but by the 1890s, the mining bonanza was over. Gold from the roots up, the cattle bonanza. Between 1865 and 1885, large profits were also possible for the cattle ranchers who raised their herds on the prairie grasses and used cowboys, many of whom were black or Hispanic, to drive them to the railheads. By 1880, more than 6 million cattle had been driven to the northern markets, but the establishment of ranches with barbed wire and the invention of new technologies like the refrigerated rail car ended the possibility of and need for the great drives. Sodbusters on the plains, the farming bonanza. Like the miners and the cattlemen, millions of farmers moved into the Great Plains, seeking economic opportunity as well. Known as the exodusters, many of these settlers were black fleeing oppression in the South. White or black plains farmers encountered enormous hardships, including a lack of accessible water, inadequate lumber for homes and fences, devastating hot summer winds, and savage winter storms. New farming methods. Several important inventions, innovations, and adaptations made farming on this treeless, semi-arid plains not only possible, but also profitable. Dry farming, new plants, and new machinery were among the innovations that facilitated the rise of huge bonanza farms. Discontent on the farm. Bad weather, low prices, and the rising railroad rates stirred up many farmers' anger, leading to some to form political lobbies and others to adopt more scientific, commercial methods. The Grange and the Farmers' Alliance were organizations that worked for farmers' interests and met important social and economic needs. The final fling. The Oklahoma land rush of 1889 symbolized the closing of the frontier and in many ways reflected the attitudes of Anglo-Americans toward Native Americans and their land. In the 1890s, historian Frederick Jackson Turner theorized that the West and America's settlement of it explained Americans' development, shaping